Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Glad to see that you're listening in to the web lecture here for part two of chapter 9, which goes over police conduct. Let's start out by asking an honest question. What if you were a police officer in use of force training? This is a training scenario that we put new officers through so that way they know, or rather an officer in training, when is it appropriate to use the use of force, or in other words, use a gun, taser, restraints, and when it is not appropriate. So ask yourself, what would you do if you were in that training scenario? Would you be hesitant to shoot, or would you be confident about your ability to make a split-second decision? Be honest with yourself. Take a few moments, pause this video right now, and write it down, because that's what we're going to discuss when I see you on Tuesday. All right, so hopefully you paused the video and you wrote down what you think. I want to show you all two clips of things that feel really exemplify how difficult this job can be. So let's actually watch that. Actually, no, I'm gonna show you it. It's right here. Yeah.
He is one of the most outspoken critics of police use of force here in the Valley, but he gets some on-the-job training about use of force tonight.
Very interesting stuff. Reverend Jarrett Maupin led protests and marches and killed an unarmed man. Well, tonight he gets a chance to experience the split second.
People ask me every day, what do I do to look the way that I do?
Sorry for
When
the
I
ads.
tell them,
Second decisions that police have to make when encountering a suspect.
And our Troy Hayden was right along with him tonight, getting the training as well. This must have been eye-opening.
It was a really interesting experience. We've all watched those protests all over the country after police officers are accused of shooting people who aren't armed. But what would happen if one of those protesters felt what it's like to wear a badge and then be put in a life or death situation himself?
So I'm going to have you put the holster on right inside your belt loop there.
Jarrett Maupin gets his weapon. You might recognize him as a high-profile organizer in the minority community. Just last month, he led marches on Phoenix Police headquarters after an officer shot an unarmed man.
We want his badge. We want his gun. We want his job.
Today, he accepted an invitation to look at things from the other side, agreeing to go through a force-on-force training session with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. 3 scenarios where you have to decide to shoot or not shoot. Scenario 1 is a call about a man casing cars in a parking lot. Maupin approaches the man and starts asking questions.
What? You're looking for your vehicle. What kind of car do you drive?
Whenever you're hitting your gun.
What kind of car do you drive?
It's my car, man.
Maupin, the officer, is shot. It happens that fast.
What time did you think that it was time for you to address the use of force that was given?
When he came to the back of the vehicle,
Okay.
and was hiding, I could sense something was wrong.
Scenario 2, a call of 2 men fighting.
What's going on today, gentlemen? What's going on today, gentlemen? What do you want? What's happening here?
What's wrong with
Back
you?
up.
Huh?
What are you doing, man?
Hey, he shouldn't approach me. He shouldn't approach me. He
We were
shouldn't
just
approach me.
arguing
He shouldn't
about what
approach me.
happened in there.
Yeah.
What are you doing? You just shot him?
Hey, he rushed me.
Tell me why you shot.
Well, I've shot because he was within that zone. I felt there was an imminent threat. I didn't necessarily see him armed, but he came clearly to do some harm to the officer, to my person. It's hard to make that call. It shakes you up.
Again, an unarmed man was shot. Scenario 3, a call about a possible burglar walking down the street. Maupin gets him on the ground. He's not complying.
I need you to keep your hands up, sir.
For what?
Because I need to check that waistband.
For what? What are you doing?
Because
Man?
I don't know what you have under there.
Everybody, look at this guy. What are you doing?
No shots fired, but the suspect did have a hidden knife in his waistband. I went through the scenarios too, without seeing what Maupin did.
Do you have keys or do you have anything to show me that?
Don't worry about
No, I need to talk to you. Come on out over here. I'm dead. County Sheriffs, get on the ground. Get on the ground. Both of you, get on the ground. Get on the ground.
For what?
Get back. Get back.
Same results for both of us. Things happen very fast out here. I asked Maupin what his biggest takeaway from this exercise will be.
I didn't understand how important compliance was, but after going through this, yeah, my attitude has changed. This is all unfolding in 10 to 15 seconds. People need to comply with the orders of law enforcement officers for their own sake.
Thanks to the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office for taking us through that today. It was an eye opener.
That's a tremendous admission that
So I also wanted to get this. Oh.
Special agent for the FBI. He's my sergeant today.
Oh, and the prior video that we just saw was looking at the stuff that they deal with day to day on patrol. This is a more specialized, rather I should say, this is a more unique example. It's uncommon, but you will still experience this if you're a patrol officer. Just won't be as common.
Responding, which is you, to a domestic call of an EDP person, emotionally disturbed person who left his residence and after threatening to kill himself at his residence.
My hands are already sweating.
And this is good. This is the stress that a cop is already feeling daily.
Okay, I'm ready.
See anything in his hands?
Can we come in, Sean?
No,
No, he doesn't have anything in his
Okay,
hand.
go ahead and go in.
do not come in.
Sean, we just want to help you out and make your
There's
family
nothing
feel
you
more
can do.
comfortable.
There's nothing you can do. My world is over. I'm done. I'm ready to die. I suggest you leave or we're all going to die.
Why do you think your world is over?
Why do I think my world is over?
Mhm.
You talk to my wife. What do you think?
Why don't you show us your hands? Let's see your hands. Show us your
Who
hands.
are you?
I can see your hands in there, but can you just put us all at ease by putting your hands on the table?
How's that?
How about both of them?
How about no?
How about you put both your hands on the table for me?
How about you leave?
Put your other hand on the table for us.
I'm telling you now, if you don't leave, I'm going to kill everyone in this room, including myself.
So why don't you put your other hand on the table? No, put your other hand on the table.
I'm telling you, it's time to leave.
What would you do? Shoot or not shoot? Sean is mentally ill, suicidal. His wife wants you to save him.
There's a gun.
Now,
There's a gun. He's got a gun. Listen, place your hands on top of your head.
Listen to my partner. Place your hands on top of your head. We only want to help you. That's all we want to do. We don't want
there is
anyone to get hurt
no
today.
help.
There is help, Sean. I promise you.
There's absolutely nothing you can do but leave.
Come on, you need to put your
Leave
hands on top of your head.
now.
You don't want to, you know.
Leave. No, what's the
You don't wanna
problem?
hurt
Why are you not
anybody.
responding to me?
Carol, we got to
You
get this
want
guy.
me
He's
to
got-
respond?
Okay, bam. You're dead.
If this were a real emergency, I'd have died. I didn't want to shoot him. Even when he had the gun on the table, I didn't believe he would shoot me.
Right.
Right? But he did.
Right.
So that was because I'm not used to dealing in those situations.
First off, he wasn't showing you his hands. That's a problem.
Gave me a false sense of security because by then I had my own gun out.
Right.
When I saw his gun, and I thought, well, he's not going to shoot me because I have my gun out.
Right.
So as soon as he put the gun on the table, I could have shot him.
Sure, because action beats reaction all the time.
If he presents the threat to you, then you have the right to use deadly force, not just to protect your life, but to protect your partner or anybody else. Because if he shoots you both, he can then go out and be a deadly, imminent danger to the public.
Okay, so after hearing that or seeing it, what do you think? I'd be curious. I mean, of course, I'm going to see you on Tuesday, but think about that. Think about how difficult it actually is and how, I mean, obviously those scenarios are designed to appear as if there's a no-win for the officer in that scenario, because there really isn't. But do you think you'd make the right call in those decisions, in those scenarios? And also, what were the right decisions? Okay, so now let's talk about police pursuits. Police pursuits can take in the form of being in a vehicle or, being on foot. It could also be in the water, on boats and everything. But I just mainly want to focus on police pursuit on foot and the vehicle. On foot is actually extraordinarily dangerous, although it may not seem so. Running full speed through areas that are not designed to be run full speed through in itself is dangerous. The same way it is with a car. You know, it's not designed for every car to try to go over 100 plus when everyone's going like 40. But you could be brought into areas on foot that you're not familiar with. They could lead you to a trap, lead you to people who don't want your best interests, you know, or don't have your best interests in heart, like an ambush. It's very dangerous. Or, you know, and this is something that not really that thought about. As a police officer, you have a firearm on your holster, so you automatically think that you'll have the upper hand, or at the very least, you'll not be outmatched in any scenario. But someone on foot, running on foot, could just have a knife, turn the corner, and wait for you. And if you're unlucky enough, they can stab you. You know, close the ground. How fast can you react when you're running full speed and turning a corner? Not very fast. Second, it's important to note that when you're in the car, it's extremely dangerous because it can not only cause property damage, it can cause personal damage. You know, private people, injuries, death. Almost half, I think the last statistic I saw was 49% of people who are injured in vehicle pursuits were innocent third parties. These were people on the highway, on the roads, driving, that had nothing to do with the police chase. But because either the police officer or the person who is fleeing is driving erratic, going through intersections, maybe, yeah, whatever it is, they clip people, they run into people, they ram them. And also, not to mention, they could, you know, carjack, but it's very, very unsafe. Because of this, as we know, there's a high probability of damage to property and people. We have to try to control the situation whenever possible. If you're in a police department that is fortunate enough to be have enough support, either because they're a huge police department and have a budget, or maybe the state will help them out. But sometimes you can get aerial pursuit. You know, you can get air support, and they'll be able to follow the car at a safe distance, so the police officers can follow along, but much slower. The idea is to not let the person, you know, get out of your line of sight. So as long as the helicopter is following them, the cop car doesn't have to be right behind them and make them feel as if they need to floor it and, you know, drive erratic. Now, because of that, there are some police departments who have disengage as an option. Now, some police departments have like policies in place or internal policies, but they're not actual law about when they should disengage. But because it's not uniform, it's only worth discussing each individual police department because that would take forever. So instead, let's just look at a continuum of when it's recommended that you should disengage and what is the appropriate response. Okay, so if we look at this figure, we can start down at the bottom left, which is the beginning of the pursuit, okay? And we see that right away, disengage, darker blue, is always going to be an option. And as you go to the right, you see that the risk level is going to be higher, and thus the use of force is probably going to be higher. So control level 1, tailing pursuit of the position, or reduced interval, which is basically you're following along, but you're not directly behind them. And you do this for people who have traffic offenses, you know, less serious crimes. A lot of the times they don't know that they have to be pulled over, right? You're speeding, cop pulls up behind them or speeds up to then pull up behind them. You know, you're tailing them. You're in the pursuit of the position, offset. And the person realizes this and then they pull over. Once you go a little bit further, you might have someone who does a hazardous traffic offense, and they're seen as a moderate public threat. You might want to do controlled termination device. So you might want to actually decide whether or not you want to actually escalate to number 3, which is a really small area there, which is when you think that the person is hazardous and they provide a threat. Now, to be clear here, you can't just ram everyone, shoot out the tires in the middle of a police pursuit because they're fleeing from not wanting to pay a speeding ticket, as long as they're not posing danger yet. Remember, these are people thus far that we have discussed that do not usually justify lethal force and do not present a high level of threat to the public. So what do we try to do here? Let's box them in, you know, get a bunch of police cars together. We can try a rolling roadblock or stationary roadblock. You know, it's just you lay out things on the floor. You might want to just block off the area, anything to get the person to not be able to drive anymore. Level 4 and level 5 is when you start to realize that taking someone's life might actually be justified. This is when life-threatening felonies that justify lethal force, like someone fleeing away from a really, really bad crime, or they're just driving very, very erratic, and you realize that you might actually need to collide into them, basically ram them. And if this is in progress, life-threatening assaults, you might need to use the use of firearms. Okay, so now that we looked at misuse of firearms, misuse of force with restraining people, and also hot pursuits, the common theme here is that a police officer can deprive someone of their rights, whether or not they're actually following the letter of the law. And if they do that, they can be liable for being sued civilly. A Section 1983 lawsuit is a civil rights lawsuit. It can be filed by someone whose civil rights have been violated. The victim can file the lawsuit if the wrongdoer was acting under the color of the law. Their civil rights, they're going to be guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution and certain federal laws. So in other words, a police officer was acting in accordance with the laws in their state, maybe their local municipality, however you feel as if your civil rights are violated, which federal given rights supersede those at the local or state level. And this is usually due to a liability. What is a liability? It's a legal obligation incurred for an injury which is sustained from the result of someone failing to act in a proper way. So in other words, most of the time when these local and state laws are actually made, they're made with federal laws in mind, right? So when a police officer says that they were acting in accordance with their law, what their local PD and other people are going to try to argue is that, no, you're liable for this, right? Your liability because you did not act within the accepted range or that standard, right? Because the U.S. Bill of Constitution, the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights define the civil rights and civil liberties guaranteed for each citizen by the government. And these liabilities come forth when someone is supposed to be acting in accordance with this given standard, but is not. Now also remember, other civil rights protections with specific relevance to law enforcement are also guaranteed under 42 USC 1983. All right, so let's continue our discussion on civil liability. We've already touched a lot on the USC 1983 protections, which, to reiterate, those are the protections that are granted to us by the Constitution and federal, subsequent federal statutes. If a police officer or any law enforcement officer, for that matter, deprives us of those rights, we can use this to essentially sue them. Now, what are some other protections? Or I guess let's actually look at the subsequent effects of the protections, because there are a lot of people, police officers, federal law enforcement, that, well, in particular, let's go with police officers. They are in constant fear of what they would describe as litigophobia. Now, they may not necessarily call it that, but essentially they are concerned that their actions, even if they're carrying out to the truest extent the letter of the law, they might still be sued. Now, the fact that this has become an issue in the past, 20 years or so, probably more recently than that, the window's probably a little bit shorter, is proof that there's probably a correction that needed to be made in the market. It's a nice way of saying that there was probably too much of activity that was going on that probably violated some people's rights, or people didn't realize their rights are being violated, or maybe they, say there's some behavior that's in a gray area, and now they feel emboldened to do something about it. So the pendulum has swung in the opposite direction. A term like litigophobia might describe it that it may have gone a little bit too far, but nevertheless, it's a correction that needed to happen. Now, let's look at the Brady duty to disclose exculpatory evidence. Now, if you remember, exculpatory evidence is evidence that typically a prosecutor would have, or a police officer might have, not hand over, but this is evidence that that the defendant, if we're going to a trial, is actually innocent, or it could be proven, or the evidence could lead to them being proven that that they're actually innocent. So the Brady duty is essentially, or stating another way, right, leaving out exculpatory evidence may lead to liability of false arrest. Remember, they're being sued here, civil liability, malicious prosecution, and illegal search and seizure claims. To support such liability claims, a plaintiff must show that the affiant knowingly and deliberately or recklessly disregard the truth, omitted facts that are material or necessary to finding probable cause. Which is, so it's interesting that they phrase it this way by saying finding probable cause, because that's the justification needed to arrest, the level of scrutiny put there just to make an arrest successfully. So this is saying that if you had this information, you wouldn't have even you wouldn't have had the capacity to establish probable cause because it essentially exonerates them. There's some other things to look at. There are lawsuits and SWAT. So one thing to remember, if you are serving on a SWAT team, or if you ever consider special forces, or even if you're just in emergency response, SWAT has had a bit of a history of moving fast and breaking things, which is used to be, I think, I don't know if it was Google's or Facebook's old motto. It was one of the two. But essentially, what the text describes as saying, if you're gonna be in SWAT, do everyone a favor, and when you breach, when you actually go into an area, try not to break everything if need be. And that sounds really silly, but they do get sued for that. So what are some other ways to reducing civil liability if you're a police officer? One, apologize. Apologize often. People are human, and sometimes they are not looking to gain. They're not looking for retribution. Sometimes they're just looking for a human moment. Or you can stop them from wanting to sue or just get really angry and file a grievance. Sometimes if you did something wrong, just acknowledge it and apologize. Write very thorough incident reports, because it is going to be, if something like that does go to court, your word against theirs. And this event is probably the most memorable event that this person, if we're talking about a civilian, is going to have in their life for like the next 3 years. It's going to be very abnormal because they don't typically do a police. If you're a police officer, you might have 3 events like that a month, or maybe 5, or depending on what precinct you're in, maybe every week. You're not going to remember everything. You think that you are, but you're not. The mind is an interesting thing. It is designed to discover. It is not designed to retain everything. So you're very, very good, if you ever think about it, of thinking of new ideas, but those ideas are always fleeting. They always go away. So do yourself a favor. Use that time, that information that you have, write everything down. And lastly, let's talk about body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras sometimes are referred to as a double-edged sword. At first, there was a lot of reluctance with people not wanting them, but now most police officers, or I can't say most, I don't speak for them, but you hear a bigger audience in support of body-worn cameras, because they feel as if it protects them, because they think in their mind, I'm not doing anything wrong, and this is just going to show it. This protects them from frivolous claims, and more importantly, because the time of modern day social media, disingenuously edited clips possibly of what they're doing on the internet. So the body-worn camera captures the entire thing. All right, so let's talk about other vices that can plague police conduct. Corruption is going to be the biggest one we're going to talk about, but just remember that sometimes it can be corruption, brutality, which is, using extreme excessive force there. Extortion, so you are essentially using coercive tactics to get someone to do something that they wouldn't normally do. Bribery, so they can accept money or some other exchange of value for conduct, whether it be to do something or to not do something. They can also be accused of theft, rape, aggravated battery, drug trafficking, murder, excessive force, anything you can think of. It can still fall under the activity. Like I said, police are just humans. But let's focus on corruption. How would you define corruption? Take a few moments to think to yourself. All right, now see if your definition, how close it was to this. So corruption is a violation of integrity through the abuse of one's role or position, or the influencing of a person in authority, either for personal benefit or the benefit of another. Corruption occurs when an officer misuses authority for personal gain, including accepting gratuities, which are gifts. Now, there are several different ways you can misuse authority for personal gain. Some of the key elements is the conduct prohibited by law? Is there a law saying that you can't do that? If the answer is yes, it's probably corruptive by nature. 2, does the conduct involve the misuse of a position? Is your position not intended for you to do this? If the answer is yes, it's probably not a good activity. You should probably stop it. And lastly, does the conduct involve a reward or personal gain for the officer? If the answer is yes, if you were getting this benefit for no other reason other than the fact you're an officer, it may not be good. Now, to be clear, you can probably already think of activities that have some of these elements that most people don't see as corrupt, which is to say that you don't need all the elements to happen. But it's probably a good rule that the more of them that are present, you probably would go as far as to say that it's corrupt. So if you go to a place and they say we have a first responders discount, or we give law enforcement 10% off their meal, you may not necessarily consider that corrupt, although there are some people who are absolutists that say that is a form of corruption. But giving officers free food every day, and then asking them in return to do something like to patrol the area a little bit better or to provide you special treatment, is a form of corruption. So there's a lot of gray areas there. But with that being said, most of the time, corruption falls under that same standard as abuse. You may not be able to necessarily define it, which is why even though we have a definition here, we still list the key elements. Like, I can't define it, but I'm going to know it when I see it. You know, a dog knows the difference between when you bump into it with your leg and when you kick it. They understand the intent behind the activity. So I put these two images here to illustrate some views that some of us may have with regards to police misconduct or just corrupt police officers in general. The one on the left, most of you would recognize that as a bad apple, and that the rest of the apples actually, well, some of them look pretty good. And the idea behind this is that you need to remove the bad apples. You cannot let the bad apples ruin everything, because if you can just identify just a few key police officers that are repeatedly exercising their discretion poorly and being involved in misconduct, we would want to remove those people. I mean, this is not a new concept. We do that in our normal criminal justice system. You know, if there's a bad person, we try to incapacitate them, and then we decide what the intent of it is afterward. You know, is it just strictly we think we just got to adjust the sliding scale of punishment on the via deterrence, right? Do we want to increase the severity so other people think it's a bad idea? Are we going to, you know, give them their just desserts, punish them accordingly? We're going to do an equity-based thing, retribution. You know, either way, the idea is remove the bad apple, right? But there are other people who think that the whole institution in general is the problem. So maybe not a bad apple, or necessarily wondering how the bad apple got there. Maybe they're bad barrels that can facilitate the growth of bad apples. And that's also worth considering. There are police departments who, in all likelihood, or rather, let's say individual precincts within police departments, although to be fair, most police departments don't have multiple precincts. So maybe that's a blind spot that I have, because I think of most police departments as being much bigger than they actually are. But nevertheless, you might have a small or medium-sized, whatever, let's just say in a system that rears people in such a way that incentivizes people to essentially go bad, or it heavily pushes them without realizing it. Maybe there are no explicit incentives, but there are a lot of social ones. So they're not telling you to go do corrupt things, but they also do things like, hey, you know what? If one of our own do something bad, you just don't say anything. We got that blue wall going. There's several different ways in which you can facilitate bad behavior and cultivate bad apples, but sometimes it's worth realizing, is it just the individual apples that are there that are bad because they're bad? Or is it the institution in general that is making the apples bad? And if that's the case, then you need to wonder, why do some apples go good and some apples go bad? Okay, so one way in which you can identify bad apples and bad barrels is to look at the ethical underpinnings behind these institutions. So how do police necessarily learn about ethics? And just to be clear, think about what comes to mind when you think of ethics. Several different definitions. I'm sure some are more right than others. Usually they deal with what is perceived to be right and just, which is not very helpful, because if everyone was objective, or in the respect that we could all come to an agreement on what those things are, that would be great. But unfortunately, we have proven thus far that we're really bad at agreeing at things. Things are almost exclusively subjective, because, you know, how we perceive things is based on our, you know, brain chemistry, which is influenced by past behavior and experiences. Well, let's say this experiences. So my definition is no better than the other ones, but I usually define it as doing the right thing when no one's looking. which is a lot harder than, let's say, doing the right thing, because your ethical or moral compass may compel you to do the right thing. But the fact that no one else is going to know about it takes away an element of social pressure. So doing the right thing when no one's looking is what I consider to be probably the best definition for ethics. Because, one person's still going to know, right? You're going to know what you did. So we have to provide, checks and balances, right? Or just look, let's see our check sheet. So is the activity illegal or is it legal? If it's legal, you're probably not doing bad thus far. Is the behavior balanced? So is the institution, right? Is everyone perceive it as fair, balanced, right? And lastly, when you're doing this, how will it make you feel about yourself, right? Or make it feel about myself. If I know deep down inside, we'll have that inner voice, so you can call it a conscience. If it's telling you that your activity is wrong, it's probably not right. You should probably check it. If you wouldn't feel comfortable doing this around other people and they're watching, it's probably not a good idea to do it. So honesty, honor, morality, allegiance, principled behavior, and dedication to the mission. They're all very important. Theories, concepts, theories, right? Very important. Integral components to how someone can actually behave ethically as a police officer. We have safeguards in place to stop this. I mentioned the Brady Rule before, which says that if you find a piece of exculpatory evidence, you have to turn it over. Even if the person you would define them as like a scumbag, even if they're a bad person, you don't have to be the one that's going to lock them up forever, even if you want to be. If they really are as bad as the person as you say, they're going to get caught again, or something else might happen to their lives, or maybe they'll just stop, but you don't need to be that person. And lastly, if you try to fudge stuff, eventually it'll catch up to you in other ways. So if you have a witness who is deemed unreliable, who is lying, and worst part, that they're lying, and you put them on the stand anyway, and we're doing this from the perspective of the prosecution, you put them on the stand and you call them, you only get to ask direct questions, which are basically almost exclusively like yes, no. You can ask them to lay out the scene, describe stuff, but everything has to be direct. There can't be much, can't do a lot of speculation there with comparison to how the defense can do it. Because when you have cross-examination, they can ask leading questions like, wouldn't it be seen as bad if this happened? Whereas you can't do that as a prosecutor. You can't lead the person into a question. You can't place forth leading questions, right? And eventually, if you put up a weak witness that shouldn't be there in the first place, they're going to be impeached, and their credibility is going to be tarnished, and it's actually going to make you look really, really bad. Because if it goes bad enough, they actually do get impeached. What they say is going to be taken out of the record anyway. All right, so let's talk about building an ethical police department. First, the application selection process. As we've discussed before, some police departments can be a little bit more picky than others, but overall, typically, the harder the application process, or the more rigorous the background is, you would presume that you'd get a higher tier applicant. That's why they look at federal and local law enforcement and say that typically it's harder to get hired at the federal level because the application process is harder. They weed out a lot more behaviors, and a lot of that has to do with personal choices. Through things like what you've done in your life. The polygraph and like the initial screening interviews are so incredibly important. I know at some federal agencies, they cut out 97% of the applicants with just those two things. And a lot of it has to do with, either personal drug use or just activities in your social life, personal social life. And they do that for a reason, actually, which kind of makes sense in a way. One, I mean, with regards to the personal activity with the drug use, because you knew it was a federal crime, right? For some of the drug use, remember that expression, do the quote unquote right thing when no one's looking. But two, especially with regards to the polygraph, federal law enforcement does this a lot, not so much at the local level, but they might ask you questions on integrity. And integrity is important, goes back to that ethical consideration with not only your job, but also your personal life, your love life. Because at one point in time, you swore, whether your hand was on a book or you looked him in the eyes and you said, I'm not going to do this, whatever this behavior is. And then if you did it, I'm pretty sure if they polygraphed you at the beginning of that social relationship and asked you, are you going to do this? You're going to say no. And you wouldn't be called a liar either, because you probably had no intention to. But, opportunity, time, it all changes people. And that's the unfortunate reality. And that's why the application selection process is so important. The different ways in which you can discriminate on applicants. You can discriminate on them based on education, based on experience. There's a lot of things. Remember, we discussed that typically the higher educational attainment typically skews to people who use the force less. Also, the same thing with female officers tend to use lethal force less. So there are different ways in which you can screen the application process to get the makeup of a police department you want that you think is going to be successful. 2, you have to have consistent refinement of values through training and professionalization. You never have to stop trying to make your institution better, because there's always room for improvement, because the police department has to evolve with the times, and the times are constantly changing. Anti-corruption posture of checks and balances. You have to set the tone. You have to let people know, if you're in command staff, that certain activities not going to be tolerated, and there's nothing that they can do to change your mind. And furthermore, if they do stuff like this, there's going to be consequences. Like I said, checks and balances. And lastly, internal investigations, or IA. These are the people who are going to investigate your behavior if it's deemed unethical, and these people need to be the hall monitors, if you will. They need to make sure that no one's doing anything that's illegal, and if so, they have to investigate it credibly. And if something happens and they find information that's incriminating, they have to go forward. Sometimes it's going to involve a fellow officer losing their job or their freedom. Maybe they might go to prison, but that is part of the job. That's how you self-regulate. So you have these bodies for a reason. All right, so I got another discussion question for you, which we'll go over on Tuesday. Question: what makes an ethical police department? I know it's a broad question. Take a few moments yourself, pause the video, jot some stuff down. What do you think makes an ethical police department? What are some things that, if you can't say I don't know what makes an ethical police department, but I know what doesn't, you can list those too. List things that you think a police department should do and what they shouldn't do. All right, now this concludes our second half of Chapter 9. I know the due date there for Quiz 3 is at the end of the week. Depending on when I send this out to you, I am in all likelihood probably going to give you either to the middle of the week or the end of the week, but I'll put that in the email. So I want you all to take care, enjoy, and see you next week. Bye.